Our third presenter is Michael Wohl. Michael Wohl is an associate professor of psychology at Carleton. His research focuses on the causes and consequences of harm doing at both the interpersonal and intergroup level. This research, as he says, examines, among other things, the emotional reaction that stems from harming or being harmed, for example, anxiety or guilt, and their effects on psychological and physical health. Ultimately, his work is oriented towards seeking the means for forgiveness and reconciliation. Michael Wohl has published over 50 peer-reviewed articles in academic journals, as well as 20 chapters and research reports. He's also an associate editor of Basic and Applied Social Psychology, and he's on the editorial board of 3 other academic journals. Where's Michael? Michael.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for staying. It's always hard being the last talk of a conference. I hope I can put a capstone on the conference, but I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you for inviting me. If there is a current that runs through this conference, it is likely the need, the importance of remembering and to understand memory. And so for the past 15 years, this is actually, this is what I've been researching. And I think a quote that really sums everything that we've heard over the last couple of days and what I will be speaking about today is a quote by William Faulkner. That is, "The past is not dead, it's not even past." What I try to do, what I've been doing for the past 16 years, is trying to understand why the past is not past and how the past influences contemporary attitudes and behaviors of victimized groups. Now, to understand the research that I'm going to be presenting to you today, you have to understand the theoretical background. And most of the research that I do stems from what's called social identity theory by Tajfel and Turner. And according to social identity theory, part of our sense of self is derived by our membership in groups. So I can think about myself as a unique individual, myself as Michael Wohl, but I can also see myself as members of various groups. So being a Canadian, and thus everybody who is a Canadian in this room is part of my in-group. I can think about myself as a psychologist, and thus people in the room who happen to be psychologists are members of my in-group, and those who are not are members of my out-group. I can think of myself as Jewish. Okay? And when I think about myself in terms of my group membership, it ends up influencing my attitudes, my behaviors, and you'll also see my emotions. Now, to take a step back, I like to think about my personal identity. I find that it's easier for a lot of people to think about personal identity, and then I transmit it, I transpose it onto the group level. Because I like to see myself, I like to understand my personal identity as being made up of experiential building blocks. Okay? So we see this Jenga tower here that I'll get to in a second, but who I am today is made up of my memories. Okay, my experiences. Similarly, my social identity, myself as a Canadian, myself as a Jew, is made up of experiential building blocks. Building blocks that came before I was born, okay, and what will happen after I die. Now, how many people in this room have played the game Jenga? Okay? So what happens in the game Jenga? You take a block from the middle, you put it on top. Now, what emotion might you be experiencing while you're playing Jenga? Anger? If? Well, that might be at the end of what might happen, but while you're actually engaged in it, what might you be experiencing? Anxiety, right? What is the anxiety about? The anxiety is about this, the tower eventually falling over. Now, I'll submit to you that there are a number of groups, social groups, who are very concerned about their experiential building blocks that make up their social identity eventually falling over. That is, that one day their group might be no more. Now, what emotion might be experienced when you are thinking about the eventual disappearance, the possible disappearance of your group? Well, my colleagues and I, we have labeled this collective angst, or the concern for the future vitality of your group. Now, this is based on an appraisal of threats and a threat to your group that may be, if this threat is followed through on, that my group might one day be no more. It may be completely removed. It's important that it may be completely removed from the group's contemporary lived experience. So I do a lot of research with Quebecois. This is a group who's very concerned about the future of their culture and tradition. But currently, the culture and tradition is thriving. It's about a projection into the future of what might happen down the road. Now, what's important about emotions and collective angst is that they all have action tendencies associated with it. So when you experience a specific emotion, it tends to lead to a specific action. Okay? So when one experiences anger, okay, you might approach somebody. Okay? When you're experiencing fear, you might avoid. What is the action tendency that's associated with anxiety? Preparation. Okay? So if there are students still in the room, if you're preparing for, if you're feeling anxious about your exam that's going to be coming up next week, you are going to prepare. You're going to try to protect yourself by studying. When you feel collective angst, you are going to try to protect the future of your group. You're going to try to engage in in-group protective behaviors. And so what I've been doing with my research on collective angst is trying to identify the different ways that group members will try to engage in these in-group protective behaviors in order to avoid the possible disappearance of their group. And so I've looked at contemporary extinction threats. Okay? Something that Canadians are very concerned about is the Americanization of Canada. And so when I make this salient, what tends to happen is that they end up supporting in-group protective behaviors like the CRTC, the Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission, who, by the way, you may not know this, but they control what we see on TV and the radio. So there is a portion of every radio hour that is dedicated to Canadian music. That's why we listen to Nickelback so much. Okay? Now, threats can also stem from the past. And that's where my research that I'm going to be presenting to you today stems from. Okay? That the threats from the past, the historical extinction threats from the past, can be carried forward in a group and be projected into the future. Okay? So I won't spend too much time on this particular study, but people in this room might be familiar with Eurovision. Okay, I won't go into too much depth into this, but this Eurovision, for those who don't know it, think about it as American Idol on steroids, but instead of individuals, you have countries competing against each other. And so a colleague of mine and I want to look at countries who have experienced extinction threats. Are they more likely to sing their song at Eurovision in English or their native tongue? These are the two options. And what we found is that countries that have been under extinction threat are more likely to sing their song in their native tongue. Okay? Now I want to tell you a little bit about where my research stems from. I'd like to say research is me-search. Okay? And I have always been interested in understanding, being a Jew myself, the effects that the Holocaust has on my generation. Okay? 3 generations, 2 generations removed. Okay, what kind of effect? I was in Israel in 2000 and I saw this swastika spray painted on the side of a synagogue. I thought to myself, what is the effect of Holocaust reminders? What effect does it have on contemporary Jews' attitudes and behaviors? Now we know from Yehuda, who's done extensive research on this, showing PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in second-generation Holocaust survivors, and that the past can evoke powerful emotions that can affect us today. And what I'm going to suggest is that the past may evoke collective angst when we are reminded, when we remember the Holocaust. And so in the first study that I did with my colleague Nyla Branscombe and Stephen Risen, is that we first just assessed it. We asked 82 North American Jews about the extent to which the Holocaust is salient to them. So the Holocaust is an event that's very salient to me. Collective angst, the concern for the group's future vitality, and various in-group protective behaviors. The desire to donate money to Jewish organizations, to marry a fellow Jew, to pass along Jewish traditions and culture to subsequent generations. And what we found here is that the extent to which the Holocaust was salient predicted the desire to engage in in-group strengthening behaviors. Okay? Holocaust salience also influenced collective angst. So the more the Holocaust was salient, the more concern that they had for the future vitality of Jewish culture and traditions. And collective angst predicted in-group strengthening. Now, for those who may not be statistically inclined here, what I'm about to show you is what's called a mediation analysis. I regressed Holocaust salience and collective angst simultaneously on in-group strengthening. And what I found is that the direct effect of Holocaust salience on in-group strengthening disappeared. What does this mean? It means, let's see if wasn't that hard. I'm going to have to tell Jaime when I see him next. Okay, so the path is like this. Okay, we may see a direct relationship, but that's only because it goes through collective angst. So you have an appraisal. Jaime talked about appraisals. You think about a situation. You then have an emotional reaction, collective angst, and it's that emotion that drives the behavior. We tend to think that it's our thoughts that drive the behavior. It's our thoughts that drive emotion that drive our behavior. Now, the first study was just correlational, so I wanted, as an experimentalist, I need to understand causality, and the way that you do that is that you manipulate the independent variable, your predictor variable. And so what we did is we had Jews, either we primed Jews with the Holocaust, okay, by having them write about the impact the Holocaust has had on the Jewish community, or we just asked them to write about life as a member of the Jewish community. Now, why did we do that? Because we wanted to make our participants' social identity salient in both conditions. So in both conditions, we primed Jews to think of themselves as Jews, as opposed to just unique individuals. But in one of the conditions, we primed them with the Holocaust. Think about the Holocaust. What we found here is that there is a greater reporting of collective angst in the Holocaust salience condition than in the control condition. We also saw a greater desire to engage in these in-group strengthening behaviors in the Holocaust salience condition. And now you see this fancy slide that ended up taking me way too much time to put together. And once again, we saw this mediational path. What does this tell us? Okay? Why does history matter? History matters because history provides us with existential security. Okay? What does that mean? Okay? We are going to eventually die. Okay? But our group continues on. And we find security in our group membership. We want to teach our children about our group's history and our group's culture because they will continue on well past the time that we are no longer here. Lewin, also known as Levine, okay, one of the fathers of social psychology, expressed it nicely when he said that the moment that we start seeing this ground that our group membership provides, this existential security that the group membership that it provides, the moment that we start thinking that it might give way, we are extremely affected. And we are going to act in ways to protect our group that provides existential security. So I'll wrap up with one other study. One study that I think hopefully kind of brings this conference together, okay? Which is, should we discuss the Holocaust or not? Right? We know that when trauma is experienced, sometimes people shut down. They don't want to talk about it, okay? That there is a culture of silence that surrounds it. And what is the effect? Well, once again, I provide a quote by Lewin. Levine, I prefer calling him. When he moved over to the States, Levine became Lewin. He was discussing in this quote about the decision amongst many Jews not to talk about anti-Semitism. But I think that it speaks quite nicely to the Holocaust as well. And what he said is failing to discuss does not help the child. Okay? But on the contrary, it is most likely to have the opposite effect. It is poor pedagogical policy, likely to bring the child into unnecessary grave conflict. It weakens his ability to cope with difficulties. And so we wanted to look at this. And the data that I'm going to present to you looks very similar to the data that Jaime Annisman presented with the Aboriginal community. And I did a mass testing of the Jewish population. I was in Ottawa. I was able to recruit 84 Canadians, Jewish Canadians. And in that sample, we found that 34 of them were descendants of Holocaust survivors. And we asked them the extent to which they identify how important is Judaism to you. Okay? For some people, some group memberships are more important than others. Okay? So being Canadian is very important to me. I decided to spend that extra $50 to get the Canadian flag on my license plate. Okay? For others in the room, maybe being Canadian isn't all that important to who you are. Okay? So Jaime spoke about this earlier, that there's a continuum. Some identities, social identities, are more important than others. And what we want to see is, among this population, how important is identification as a Jew to you. We want to assess familial discussions about the Holocaust. Okay? How often did your family discuss the Holocaust? And we looked at Holocaust-relevant PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. What we found is this. Okay, I'm going to orient you to this graph. Okay, we have willingness to discuss the Holocaust. What we found is, and not surprisingly, these are the descendants of Holocaust survivors. They tend not to talk about the Holocaust. There didn't tend to be as much discussion about the Holocaust as with the non-descendants. And what you see is in families, highly identified Jewish families, they talked about the Holocaust even less, the descendants. Okay? What about symptoms of PTSD? Found something very interesting here. And this graph, by the way, is driven by the previous graph. Okay? This effect is driven by discussions of the Holocaust. And what we see is that identification is really important, but it has opposite effects depending on whether you are a descendant of a Holocaust survivor or not. Okay? So, highly identified Jews who are not descendants of Holocaust survivors, that identification tends to buffer them against PTSD. They're less likely to experience Holocaust-related PTSD. But highly identified Jews who are the descendants of Holocaust survivors they experience the greatest amount of PTSD-related symptoms. Why? Because of the culture of silence. Okay. So, history matters. And how we contend with history matters. Okay? I think because of time, I'm going to end there and open it up to questions for myself or the other two speakers. I don't know whether we actually have the time. I know we're running kind of late. But if anybody has any quick questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you again for staying so late. I appreciate the time.